Somewhere, Wang Xiangjai says, attack your opponents where they are strongest. And I know that seems a little bit contradictory. When you think about it, it's not all that contradictory, is it? Like, if you were going to attack someone where they're weakest with where you're strongest, then it'd be kicking them in the head. But attack them where they're strongest. If you think about it, it's attack the roots, attack the legs, attack the big muscle groups and bones in the leg that are load bearing. You think about how you would chop down a tree, attack it from the bottom and then let it topple over. So it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Think about a big roundhouse kick to the thigh or something like that. It makes a lot of sense to attack the opponent where they're strongest. The question for us is how to do that, or more specifically here, how to do that in terms of natural movements. We can add in more complex movements later, what we call cultural sets, that think about more specific problematics that we want to solve and that add in more complexity to movement. But within this concept, this paradigm of fairly simple movements from a basic stance that flow naturally from simple articulations of the body, how do we attack the opponent's root? And so next we're going to look at 4 of those movements from the natural set. And these are not the kicks that you're probably used to seeing, like the low side kick and the oblique kick. These are the ones that are most commonly demonstrated in each one. Out of those 2, I have to say the side kick is the most useful. The oblique kick, it's got this power of being like, as Zhao Daoxin says, like a holy relic, and there's a standing pole posture that goes with it, so I think people can't let go of it, but it's actually not a very useful technique. I'll look at that another time. For now, let's go back to something that we looked at a few videos ago, which is the idea that when we do a balanced posture, i.e. a double weighted posture, that's not particularly useful for issuing force. And as we've said, you can't get this if you hold on to this idea that you've got some kind of exotic force that you're developing. But if you look at standing and martial arts movement in the way that Wang Xiangjai does, in mechanical terms, he literally talks about it in terms of like levers and pulleys, then it's a fairly straightforward mechanical equation to understand why this is the case. And remember that we said that to act upon the world with mechanical force, we've got to use either expansion or contraction, i.e. open or close. But if we do that in a balanced posture, even if we've got some kind of oppositional force, like moving our arms away from each other, the force either cancels itself out, it's a zero-sum equation, or else it's so weak it's not usable for martial arts. So we've got to think, let's say for example you were hitting out to the side and you try doing it balanced, and then you change and you experiment with skewing the posture over, and you can immediately feel the difference. You've basically discovered rooting. And this is what we call Yiquan's logical model. It didn't happen so simply in history, but in a logical sense, this is how you work it out. And the next logical step in that model is to think, aha, when we skew a posture over to the side, then we can brace it, we can get more power, and this is the discovery of single weighting. The next step in the logical model is to work out that you're better off starting single weighted. You're better off with a single weighted stance. This is overdetermined, so it's partly to do with being more agile and mobile from this stance, and it's partly to do with being more guarded, but it's significantly more about being single weighted. And I think this is very rarely understood. If you're single weighted in this posture, then you're halfway towards all of your postures, i.e. you've completed, remember we talked about travelling distance, you've completed half the posture just by being in this stance, and you can feel this yourself by just practicing a few basic movements. What seem like really short movements, actually an enormous amount of movement has already been conducted in the body just because you've completed that travelling distance just by being in the stance in the first place. And this is part of what we mean by the idea of stored force, and you can feel this yourself by practicing the same postures in a balanced posture and practicing them in an unbalanced posture, i.e. double weighted and single weighted, and you can feel immediately that the way the posture is braced in a single weighted posture adds more power. Well, it doesn't actually add more power, it's about the structural transmission of force, but you can feel that it's much weaker in a balanced posture than it is in a single weighted posture. And although that might seem like some kind of magic or something at first, it's nothing to do with that. It's it's hard to get your mind around it at first, but part of the movement is already completed. Even though it's frozen in stillness, it's just in the posture. Part of the movement is already completed, so you've actually added more force, more volume, more power into the posture just by being in that stance. It's more mechanically efficient, and it's rooted, so you can use what Wang Shenjai calls rebound force to transmit the force, and you can feel that immediately just by doing this experiment. Because of the mechanical nature of this idea, we can use relatively small movements that get what seem like magical amounts of power, but actually the body's moving an enormous amount. It just doesn't look like that. So by skewing the posture, we've discovered the idea of using whole body force. It's not quite unified whole body force in the way that we understand it in the more sophisticated development levels of Yiquan. It's the initial stage. So in the logical model, it's the initial stage of understanding the idea that if you get the whole of your body behind a hit, then it will be more powerful. From there, we've got to work on how we do that in the most mechanically efficient way. But we've already done a lot of work on that, so we won't rehearse all of that material now. All we need to understand at this point is that from a single weighted posture, it's possible to use very or relatively short movements of the leg to issue force against our opponent's legs, their strongest part. Our strongest part attacking their strongest parts. Very simple movements that are based on the principle that a massive part of the movement is already completed just by being in the stance. And we've just got to add that little bit of zing, that little bit of Farley into the posture, and we've got a useful technique. And the first technique we want to look at is just lifting our lead foot off the floor and hitting with the front of our foot, i.e. our toes, into the opponent's leg. Obviously, it's a shoe-wearing technique because you kick with the actual point of the foot, with the toes, not with the ball of the foot. Like you can kick with the ball of the foot, like the Trojiao technique, but for this posture, you kick with the toes, so you obviously can't do it very hard. And even with the Feiyus that I'm wearing, they're not particularly hard shoes. They're soft shoes that got a rubber bit at the front, so you would do some damage, obviously, if you put the force in, and you couldn't do it without shoes on. So it makes that interesting distinction between what is natural and what is cultural. Nothing's ever really natural that human beings do. Anyway, I don't do this posture loads. The point of demonstrating it is that it shows how easy it is to move someone's leg very often. So even though the leg might be the strongest part of their structure, usually it's a load-bearing thing, a load-bearing strut, and it's moving, and if you can just kick it at the right moment, you can take the whole structure down, and it doesn't require that much force at all. So little force, in fact, that with a pair of shoes on, a pair of soft shoes, you can do it with your toes. From there, let's look at some of the particularities of the posture. Now, normally when we do a lead leg front kick, we will spring up off the ball of the foot, so everything goes into that what we call compounded Farley. So springing up off the ball of the foot is one little bit of Farley, and then we compound that with the opening at the quad for the actual kick in. For this posture, we don't do that. We want to just lift it up, lift the whole sole of the foot up flat off the floor straight away. And this movement doesn't necessarily come naturally. It has to be practiced in different ways. Now, there are a few different reasons why we do this. One is that we don't need that extra speed that comes from that like explosive movement pushing up off the floor. A lead front kick has got a lot of travelling distance, so anything that we can do to compound the force and the speed of the movement will help. This movement is so quick anyway, it doesn't need that. And similarly, it doesn't need a massive use of open. So this is the principle that we began the video looking at, that we're already halfway towards this technique. In fact, it's such a short technique that we can say we're 3/4 of the way towards it. Unlike a front kick, which uses a big open of the quad, this just uses a little dink. The quad is already open enough to do the posture. We're just going to use speed, a little flick from the lead leg, and then we're going to rely on the structure itself to transmit the force necessary. And now remember that we said we need to lift the foot straight up, flat, and one of the very important reasons for this is we don't want the foot pointing downwards because there isn't enough time to get it to the target. So by the time we hit the target, if the foot's pointing down, then you could damage your ankle. So you've got to lift it flat, particularly as your opponent might be moving in, you're trying to manage the distance, so you don't take that risk that you're going to buckle your ankle by lifting it up heel first. lift it flat, and you can see that I'm also using a little bit of sink here, which remember creates a little bit of a compression set, i.e. it just solidifies that rear leg. And also because you're now double weighted because you stood on one leg, which remember is double weightedness in Yiquan theory, you're a little bit vulnerable in that moment, so you just use a little bit of sink to solidify the posture. And that creates this characteristic look where it looks a little bit laboured because of the way that you're having to lift the foot flat up off the floor. You can't use that push up from the ball of the foot. Now obviously there's ways of making this posture more powerful, so you can pull the foot back, do a little bit of a monkey step to create more power in the posture, more volume, so you can get a bigger run up on it, but it's totally unnecessary because you don't want to maximise the power of booting someone's shin with your toes. I mean, you might do it deliberately just to pull your foot out of the way, but there's absolutely no need to do that to increase the power. It's already quite powerful enough. Nevertheless, as we move into the next level of training, which is to make it more lively, to use footwork, then you are going to create more potential for volume in the kick. So you've got to keep it under control. You don't want to maximise force with this posture, obviously. But fluidly navigating the changes that come with footwork is the next level. In fact, Wang Shanzhai said footwork is more important than power, which is quite interesting. Still, you need power, so you've got to start adding in power and at least speed, and just regulating and controlling that, getting that little flick from the lead leg. And here you've got to keep it under control because remember, the intent is a dog. It will try and maximise power. This is a great example of where you need to rein that in. And then just watch the posture from a few different angles. Remember this really important idea of learning by looking. It's like programming your intent to see the correct movement and then you can just follow it. For the rear leg, very similar principles apply. It's absolutely fine if the heel comes up a little bit first. In fact, it's doctrine of the mean, so it makes a lot of sense. But we want to get it as flat as possible, as soon as possible, for exactly the same reasons. Now, it's not easy to just lift your foot up relatively flat from the rear, and a lot of people struggle with that. And this is one of the things that we want to train with friction step. And I'll look at this idea again when we look at friction step in detail, but I'll mention here this problem that people have where they lean right over when they're doing friction step. And I saw a video where an Yiquan instructor had said that this is the correct way to do friction step, i.e. lean your body right over, because this is how Li Jianyu taught it. And now we all love Li Jianyu and we all respect him. But in Yiquan, the correct way of doing something is never determined just by someone else said so. It's always got to have a scientific basis. And remember the idea of negative lineage and emergence. Things have got to improve over time. The only reason people leant over back in the day is because that was how it was done, and so they didn't develop the strength to do it more upright. It's as simple as that. You've got to train it with your body upright, and that makes much more sense in the reality of the context of the fight, and this posture particularly makes that obvious. The last thing you want to be doing with a posture like this is leaning your face in first, even to the side. And again, people think like they're avoiding the punch. Actually, you're just being completely predictable. What you need to do is train the strength to be able to just lift that leg up relatively flat. And so for modern friction step, we would very rarely do that big lean over like that, no matter who did it in the past. And it turns out there are multiple benefits from doing your friction step with a more upright posture. It really strengthens those back muscles, but it also makes it much easier to do things like this, lifting your foot up flat, because otherwise you'll try and compensate by pushing off the ball of your foot too much to get the speed. And as we've discussed, even for the back foot version of this, that has the danger of your toes being pointed down, and we absolutely don't want that. As for the front foot, again, it can move a little bit, but it doesn't really need to. So I'm watching my own posture here. Sometimes I'm moving the front foot a little bit, sometimes I'm not. It really can just remain steady. And one of the reasons why we want it to just remain steady like that is we're probably very close to the opponent, so we don't want to be doing any messing about, twisting around on our foot, getting unbalanced or turning our body in an odd way. It's not such an obvious set in this case. We're not going to hear it slamming into the floor, but that's why we use sink, just to press down, create that compression set. Now, if you want to do this and your opponent is a little bit further away, the principle here is that the longer you make the posture, like the further away from the hit point you are, the more you lose that structure that we're relying on to transmit force. So to keep that posture nice and tight, we use a push step, which remember is like your feet are two magnets of the same polarity, and as the rear one comes forward in this case, it like pings the front one forward, and you've got to time that just right. It's very hard to see a push step, which is why, and they're very structurally sympathetic to kicks, so they're really useful, and they're really structurally sympathetic for short, sharp movements, which is exactly what we need in this case. And remember that we spoke about using rhythm as a learning device, and there's different ways of using rhythm with a push step particularly. So you can use like a 1-2, or you can use a 1 and 2. With most kicks you want to use the 1-2 because it adds momentum, or it allows the momentum to be compounded all together into the movement. Actually, it doesn't matter so much with this. We only want the 1-2 because it's faster. We will look at all footwork separately, but just notice the movement here. See how the rear foot remains at 45 degrees. And again, hits pretty much flat because it's a really short release of force. And it's also a push step when you do the same thing backwards like that. That's retreating push step. And again, transform it into more lively movements. So we're going step by step towards live training. Remember that some things in life are a little bit more important than training, like treats and stopping and just appreciating the things that you love in life. Isn't it sad when you look on the internet and you see how many people have transformed training into something really horrible, the way they speak to other people? It should enhance life, not damage it. If we want to move forward a little bit with the rear foot, we just do a little half step out diagonally to the side. It's a bit difficult to see from that angle. Now, as you step, don't turn the toes out because that will cause you to face out. Just keep the toes turned in a little bit like that. And think about these two different ways of doing friction step. One where you turn the toe out like that, and that causes you to face out following the toe. But if you turn the toe in and do it flat like that, then that keeps your overall structure facing forwards. So both ways of doing friction step are right. We just only ever see usually like one way of doing it. There's actually a lot of different variations as we'll look at to train different things. But in this case, we can see the importance of understanding different ways of landing the foot. And then the final little thing we want to get with our kick is the little flick from the knee, a little bit like we do with a round kick or something like that. Just a little bit of a flick on the knee. That's mostly where our, what we call Farley is going to come from, but see how I'm keeping the foot relatively flat as I do that, and that's quite difficult to do. And that is one of the things, for example, that friction step will teach you. Still, it's knacky, and if you get the timing wrong, then you won't make it work. You'll feel it in your posture, like you just lose you've got to carry the structure across with the step. This is the problem with all of these little movements. Carry the structure across with the step, and if you get it wrong, then you'll feel it in your movement, you'll stumble, it just won't be right. You could actually see that my structure buckled then because it just wasn't timed right. And that more advanced level of timing in the movement is something you get as you start making the postures a little bit more lively. Now, if we want to cover much more distance, we can use the full triangle steps or the full step through. And the important thing here is to think about the way the step moves out to the side first of all. So it's going to come in and out like that, and then the foot is going to go straight forward. So this has got to be timed right. Triangle step is in and out, and then the foot goes straight forwards. But again, this is a problem with friction step. It teaches you this idea that the foot should come really close to the lead foot, which is actually highly problematic. If you've ever booted yourself in the back of the foot, which I have, then you realise you can't really do this under stress. Anyway, it's too slow, so you've got to do a kind of, it's a little bit of like of a crescent movement, but it's not the full kind of in and out like you would do with friction step. And if you're wondering why do that little kind of crescenty movement with the triangle step at all, why not just step straight forwards? Try it yourself and you'll see your legs are too far apart from one another. It's like trying to walk forwards in horse stance. So your legs are splayed and you're kind of waddling forward crotch first, which is not ideal. You see some people do that sometimes, I don't know why. But it also makes it difficult to lift your rear foot up flatter off the floor if you do that. And this is what we call a process of cultivation, just constantly fine-tuning everything, thinking about how can we make something a little bit better, what compromises do we have to make. I mean, you don't have to do that. To be functional, for example, in sport or self-defense, you don't necessarily have to do that. It just depends how far you want to take it. This is part of the path, part of the process, part of the really profound thing in each one, because it's not about physical movement at the end of the day. It's about the programming. The physical movement is just kind of accessing the programming, the socialized programming, as Wang Shangjai in so many words describes it.